Hi, my name's Paul. I'm a personal trainer and nutritionist, and this video is really about how we as a nation, and really in the West generally, are getting sicker, and it's actually not our fault. So, and this is the reason why I became a personal trainer. I'll just quickly show you my journey. So at 58, I was getting overweight, I was out of shape, and move on 8 years. This is where I am. As of today, I'm 6 weeks away from my 67th birthday. So, how do we get here? Well, it goes back to the 50s. It goes back to a man called Ansel Keys. Some people may have heard of him. So he's the one that came up with the hypothesis that fat, specifically saturated fat, in our diet was actually the cause of atherosclerosis. A very difficult word to say. Doesn't matter how many times you say it. The reason he sort of come to this conclusion was it started forming these ideas, and he done tests on rabbits, and he fed them saturated fat, and they very, very quickly developed heart disease. So he wanted to pursue it, and he designed a study which was going to take in 22 countries. It turned out to be 7 countries, so it's actually called the 7-country study. So he cherry-picked, but mainly most of the data, and he come up with what he thought was evidence that saturated fat did indeed raise people's chance of getting heart disease. It was very tenuous. When you look at the actual studies, it's a very, very tenuous link. But Keys was a very powerful man, and around about the time that he was sort of really gaining a name for himself, the president at the time, Eisenhower, suffered a heart attack, and so nutrition really became sort of the number one thing that they wanted to look at in the United States. So we're basically, the West is led by the United States. So they were the first people to want to start looking into how they could. In fact, McGovern, first of all, was involved in trying to deal with starvation, which he did do some good work in that. But anyway, it moved on from that. He's now trying to make a name for himself because he was a failed presidential candidate. So he formed the McGovern Committee. He formed the McGovern Committee, and they wanted to put together a diet plan that they thought was going to help the nation become a healthier nation. Basically, there was just a little bit of evidence that people were starting to get overweight, or they were starting to develop heart disease. It certainly wasn't as prevalent then as it is now. But anyway, they went ahead with these theories, and they based it on the sort of evidence, so-called evidence, that Keys came up with. And they eventually come across these guidelines. And so I'm going to show you some images here of what they compiled. And they're very interesting images. Massive amounts of carbohydrates, massive amounts of vegetables, and almost minuscule portions of protein. But they were convinced that this is the way to go now, because obviously based on Keyes's studies, that saturated fat and reducing fat was actually going to be the way to go to make people healthier. So, and what also came of this, the government committee and the people that were on the committee, a lot of them were politicians, but if you understand American politics, so many, in fact, nearly all American politicians are funded by lobbyists that are funding them, actually donating to them, and actually trying to steer things in their direction, basically. So we're talking about food companies, medical companies generally. So these people on the committee really wanted to steer in the direction of the people that were paying them the most money. And so they wanted to point towards using products, basically, the things that were products, the things that were making money for companies, the things that you see on the middle aisles of all supermarkets now, grain products, seed oils. These are all things I'm going to cover in other videos. But basically, they were steering how we were going to start eating as nations. And anyway, they come up with these guidelines, and basically every other Western nation followed. The UK followed. Only a couple of years later, they developed the My Plate guide, and you then got doctors and dietitians being taught this now new guideline. And doctors generally, if there's any doctors out there, you'll be able to attest to this, that doctors learn very, very little about nutrition in their studies to become a doctor. Dietitians study a lot about nutrition, but their guidelines are totally based on the government guidelines, what you see in them images. Dietitians can't wander outside of that. They can't think for themselves. A bit like doctors. Doctors should think for themselves, but they're generally taught to diagnose issues and treat issues. And to be total respect for doctors, they do a really good job, but they've got a very, very narrow field. Dietitians themselves want to do the right thing for people, but they have to follow guidelines. And unfortunately, they can't go outside of their guidelines, otherwise they lose their license to actually operate in that field of nutrition. So how did we get to where we are now? And so what you've got other bandwagons, or you've got other groups of people that have now jumped onto the belief that we shouldn't be eating fat, so ergo we shouldn't be eating animals. So you've got the vegans, you've got people that saying animal agriculture is driving climate change, and of course the food companies love this because they can jump on the same bandwagon and say, yeah, you shouldn't be eating red meat, you shouldn't be eating all this healthy stuff, you should be eating our products because the government backs us, the government tells you that is what you should be eating, heart healthy grains, 5 a day, all these things are actually made up. But the message is just pounded time and time again. Everybody's pounding the message time and time again. The media pound the message over and over again. Everybody is constantly telling you this is the way to get healthy. And there are people fighting back against this. There's people that believe animal protein is the most important nutrient that you should be getting in your diet. I tend to agree with that, although I'm not siding with any particular camp. I've got total respect for vegans if they're doing it for an ethical reason. I'm not saying you shouldn't eat vegetables. And I also believe that animal agriculture could definitely be better than it is. But that aside, the evidence now is building up that it's still anecdotal and it's still hypothetical evidence, but it's pointing more in the direction now that eating a low carbohydrate diet and more animal protein is a healthier way to go. There's always going to be people fighting back against that. As I say, the vegans, climate change groups want to push the narrative that we shouldn't be eating animals. It's healthier to grow food. Again, these are things I'm going to cover in other videos. But getting back to why we're getting sicker, we're all eating what we think is what is actually the standard Western diet. So we're eating far too much carbohydrate. We're eating far too much plant food, which in itself can be bad for us. Again, that'll be another topic for another video. But going back to the guidelines that were set in the 70s, one of the things that the food companies jumped on was this idea that we should lower our fat, because fat supposedly is what makes us fat, which is also absolute nonsense. But it spawned these products and this decades of people believing that they should eat low-fat diets, high-carbohydrate diets. And basically that's where it's got us now. That's why people are getting more and more overweight. I'm going to show you some charts here that just plot the progress of heart disease and the progress of how obesity actually started to rise in America, and actually map out heart disease increase and decline, and the rise of heart attacks, obesity, and also the use of seed oils. So the first image is heart attacks and cigarette consumption, very high through the 60s and 70s. The second image is the rise in consumption of vegetable oils, especially through the 50s right up to the present day. And the third image, correlating with the vegetable oil image, a very high increase in diabetes in the USA through the 70s up to the present day. The guidelines that they gave you back in the 70s were totally arse about face, basically upside down. They would be absolutely swamped with litigation because they could well be accused of killing millions of people over the last 40, 50 years. In the UK, it's not quite the same, but we do have the problem in the UK that they are also, to a certain extent, driven by lobbyists. They're driven by donations, people that want to steer things in their favour. I've heard, and I don't know that it's true, I haven't seen the evidence, but I've heard that even in the UK, 30% of a politician's time is involved in raising money for their campaigns and their actual activities. So you've got this massive machine, the food industry machine, that wants to drive constantly drive profits in their products. And they're going to try and steer the people that are giving us the information about what we should be doing. They're making sure that they're going to steer things in the food company's direction. So really what we have to do is we have to start looking out for ourselves. We have to take things into our own control and start going down our own rabbit holes. Basically, go down your own rabbit hole, start finding out things for yourself. That's the idea of why I'm putting this video together. I want people to start thinking for themselves and actually do some research of your own and actually find out what you want to find out, whether what you're doing is right or whether there's evidence that perhaps you could do things that could improve your health or improve the way you train, or just generally about how you're going to keep your family healthy. Another problem you have got when you do this is if you go on Google and start searching stuff, you are going to be swamped by health sites and big organisations driven by the government and food companies that are going to tell you that what they're telling you is the truth. You have to go deeper than that. There is an underground now of people that are really trying to push a different narrative that everything we've been told is wrong. You've got to find it out for yourself. You've got to find out, balance what you think is true and what you think the government is telling you is true, and start advocating for yourself. So that's really all I wanted to say on this video. Me personally, as you can see from my before and after photographs, or certainly, and it's an 8-year span in them pictures, and I don't think I look that unhealthy for someone who's nearly 67 years old. I personally have adopted pretty much 100% carnivore diet. I've now cut out all carbohydrates at my diet. I eat just meat and associated fat, and I actually do like 1 square of very dark chocolate most days. That's my little end of meal treat. But what I would suggest to anybody that goes down their own rabbit hole to try and find out what they should be doing, if you are on a vegetarian diet or a vegan diet and you decide that perhaps eating more animal protein and animal fat is a good way to go, don't do it overnight. Don't do it within a week. You need to change your dietary habits over many, many, many weeks. Otherwise, you can come into all sorts of problems to do with things that nothing to do with the diet you're changing to as much as the diet you were on. That's to do with plant toxins, plant oxalates. But again, that will be something for another video. So the message from this video is basically advocate for yourself. Don't take my word for it, because everything I'm telling you is based on hypothesis and a little bit of science, but there's very little real science to base any of this information on. What you have to bear in mind is there's big powers that are trying to drive us in a certain direction, and there's a lot more money behind the food industry as far as what you call highly processed products. There's a lot more money behind that than there is behind the meat industry. So do your own research, and if you think this is something that is actually, if this is something that is turn on a light switch for you, and you think this is something you want to pursue further, follow my other videos, share it with people that you know, you can click on the like button, subscribe to my channel. I'm going to be bringing you lots of other videos where I'm going to be looking at the studies into all aspects of nutrition. There will be a little bit of exercise thrown in there because I am a personal trainer, and I want to be able to help people get healthier. But as I say, the thing we need to understand is why, when we're trying so hard to get healthy, why are we not getting healthier?